right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have everybody here. Really great turnout, and so excited for this event. I know a lot of us have been looking forward to this since we first talked about the idea last spring, really. My name is David Buckley. I'm Paul Weber Endowed Chair of Politics, Science, and Religion in the Department of Political Science here at U of L, where I also direct the Center for Asian Democracy. CAD is wrapping up its fall semester speaker series today, so we won't have any more speakers as we go into the Thanksgiving period and then the exam period, but we will hit the ground running very quickly in the spring with great speakers focusing on Afghanistan, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Pakistan, so it promises to be a really great semester. If you're not signed up for our listserv, check out our website. There's a tab to sign up for future announcements about events. And you can always find info on our social media feeds too, on Facebook and Twitter about upcoming events. I also want to take a second to pass on an announcement about another event that will be going on very quickly in the spring semester. It'll be winter, it'll be spring semester, but this is winter, January 14th. So this will be just as we're getting started. This is the rescheduled University Global Humanities Lecture, which is a sort of major event on our intellectual calendar every year. And we're so excited to have C. Riley Sorkin come and talk about swamp tales, trans ghosts, and non-binary magical realism. This was a talk that had to be delayed for health reasons at once, and we're just so excited to have it happen on January 14th at 4 p.m. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Without any further ado, let me introduce today's speaker, Professor Vince Raphael. Professor Raphael is Professor of History and Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Washington. He was born and raised in Manila and obtained his BA from the Ateneo de Manila University before receiving his MA and PhD at Cornell University. He has held various fellowships, including at the University of California, Irvine, the Stanford Humanities Center, and as a Guggenheim and Rockefeller Fellow. His research and teaching areas include the history of the Philippines, comparative colonialism and nationalism, language and power, translation and the historical imagination, and more recently, on the comparative formation of the post-colonial humanities. He's the author of several works, including the books Contracting Colonialism, White Love, and Other Events in Filipino History, The Promise of the Foreign, and most recently, I believe anyway, this is still most recently, right? Yeah, most recently, the book that we'll talk probably most about today, The Sovereign Trickster, Death and Laughter in the Age of Duterte. President Rodrigo Duterte is now the former president of the Philippines, but his legacy still looms very large in the country. And the questions that his presidency raises about populism, humor, transgression, and authoritarianism in our communities are relevant not just in the Philippines and not just in Asia, but I think also closer to home. So we're so privileged to have Professor Raphael join us today. Thanks so much, Vince.
I can do it this way. Can everybody hear me? Is this good? Great. It's a real pleasure to be back in Louisville. I was here about 10 years ago, thanks to the invitation of Professor Bertacco, and I've had such a great time visiting. It's a wonderful campus, lots of really cool people, and I'm very, very grateful for a chance to be able to talk with you today about this topic, which never ceases to be irrelevant. As elections last week attest to, and in fact, although the focus is on Duterte and the Philippines, I think you'll find many things that resonate with our current situation in this country. And it goes without saying that in the Q&A, I would be more than happy to speak about these matters of authoritarianism. I was just telling, I don't know if it was Simona or maybe it was David, I was just saying to them this afternoon that I saw this survey, I think it was Washington Post or something, and this guy was saying, well, what do you think of authoritarianism? And most of the people said, what's that? They had no idea what that was, right? Of course, if you ask them about democracy, they'd probably say the same thing. Oh, what's that? So there's a lot of interesting sort of things going on around now. And of course, one of the things about authoritarianism is that, at least the way we talk about it in this country, and I think the way they talk about it in most places, is usually it's set in contrast to democracy, right? How do you understand? Oh, is it okay? Yeah, okay. One of the ways in which people think about authoritarianism is to compare it with democracy. But of course, we have no clear idea of what one is compared to the other. And so what I want to do today is a couple of things. First of all, some preliminary observations, right? And the question, of course, is what exactly, the first thing I want to start with is not so much the question of what is authoritarianism, because I think in the end it's going to be very difficult to define it. Rather, I'd like to ask not so much what it is, but what does it do? What kind of work does this word do, right? And the practices associated with it. How is it practiced? What are its effects? What is its history? Why does it persist, right? So to think of authoritarianism as a practice rather than, for example, an ideology. Authoritarianism, as I said, is not so much an ideology, but more like a cluster of relations, affective relations, right? It's affective relations that is spurred by a number of things. First of all, a deep sense of loss. I think many people who are attracted to authoritarianism experience this sense of loss, of a world out of whack, of things fragmented and fractured, right? And so what you get with a lot of authoritarian affect, if you want to talk about authoritarian affect, is a sense of melancholia, right? In the past, people have talked about left-wing melancholia. That is, people who suffer when the things that they struggle for come to naught. I think you could say that populism, right-wing populism, that generates authoritarianism, similarly comes out of a sense of melancholia. You know, melancholia, the way Freud, for example, talks about it, melancholia in a sense that you're much more attached to the object you lost than to the context within which that loss occurs, which is why it's very difficult to give up that object, right? So because there are two things, there's mourning and there's melancholia. When you mourn something, you work through it, you get over it, right? With melancholia, the point is you don't get over it. You cling to that object, right? And you make that object the center of your world. And it doesn't matter what happens elsewhere, right? What's important to you is you have that object, right? And I think that a lot of right-wing populism is wedded to this sense that something was lost. We want to cling on, whatever it is, white privilege, male supremacy, sort of, whatever it is, you cling to that and you ignore whatever else is around it, right? It's also characterized, I think, and this is something that's pretty obvious with, when you look at a lot of authoritarian figures today, it's also characterized as a search for a kind of father figure, right? A kind of messiah, if you will, someone who will come, who will save the world, who will take care of everything, which is why the authoritarian figure is a figure that can do no wrong. That's very important, right? Doesn't matter. They can stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody. It doesn't matter, right? The point is that this is the kind of messiah who will save you. And what authoritarianism does, for want of a better word, is to organize these affective clusters through various means, through state apparatuses, parastatal means, through the passing of laws, through education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it creates what at one point Raymond Williams used to call structures of feeling, right? Authoritarianism is a kind of set of effective relationships that creates this structures of feeling. And because they're structures of feeling, they're never settled. And one of the things that defines structures of feeling is that they're always in motion, right? They're always emergent. They never fully emerge, but they're always emergent. So they can come out in all kinds of interesting ways. And of course, historically, this structure of feeling, this affective cluster, is linked to other sort of global geopolitical phenomena like imperialism, right? Capitalism and nationalism. These are very, very big topics, which I'm happy to come back to later on during the Q&A. But just keep in mind that the question of affective relations are always related not just to individual structures of feeling, but they're also related to these larger geopolitical, long durée historical phenomena. The other thing I'd like to say about authoritarianism is it's very important to emphasize that there is no single form of authoritarianism, right? What you get is a plurality of forms. Anyone who's studied authoritarianism comparatively, right, will know this right away, right? There is no, authoritarianism you get in Argentina. It's going to be very different from what you get in Hungary, from what you get in the Philippines, from what you get in the United States. Right? That's why it's very, very important to study it comparatively in order to understand it. It's very important to stress on the contingency of authoritarianism, because this is exactly what makes it into a historical phenomenon. Right? If there's a history of authoritarianism, it's very contingent. Right? It depends on various conditions of emergence, under timing, under speed. Right? Things like recession, war, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's very important to understand authoritarianism as something that emerges always in relation to certain crisis. It's only when there's crisis that the possibility for a kind of authoritarian emergence it comes through. And it's also very important to understand their areas of weakness, points where they can be challenged, and points where they can be defied. Right. So these are the general sort of aspects of authoritarianism that I would put out there. There's many, many more, and I'm sure those of you who study authoritarianism will know and will think about other examples, other places, other ways of characterizing the way authoritarianism emerges as a function of populism, dictatorship, fascism, and all these other related terms. As David pointed out, I've written this book a couple of years ago, which concentrates on the question of authoritarianism in the case of the Philippines, right? And the title of the book is Sovereign Trickster, Death and Laughter in the Age of Duterte, right? And the juxtaposition of death and laughter is very sort of interesting. It's something I can come back to and talk about later, but it's the idea of the authoritarian precisely as a trickster figure, right? As someone who is capable of entertainment, at the same time also capable of death. Right? He delivers death as much as he delivers laughter. And the broad question I posed is, how does this authoritarian imaginary, this idea that is shared by both leader and led, how is this idea of the authoritarian imaginary, certain fantasy of sovereign power, the power to decide who shall live and who shall die, how does it circulate between ruler and ruler? Because this is a very, very important aspect, and again, I can talk about this later. It's a very important aspect of authoritarianism is the question of sovereignty, right? One of the things that the authoritarian figure promises to his followers is that of recapturing or renewing their sense of sovereignty, their ability to be able to, as it were, control their lives. And it's a control that can extend to the most extreme, which is deciding who shall live and who shall die. I want to turn my attention now to the question of the drug war and the question of Duterte as an example of illustrating, right, the sort of the emergence of something like a kind of authoritarian imaginary, right? That is a certain kind of imaginary relationship between rulers and ruled. First of all, in the case of Duterte's drug war, and the recent emergence of the Marxists, because the two are very closely connected. There's a long historical context for understanding the two. And this long historical context helps us understand how it is that a figure like Duterte and later on the Marxists are possible in a place like the Philippines. It's this history that gives them their specificity, right? And this specificity has to do with multiple sort of invasions and colonizations, first the Spaniards for about 350 years, followed by the United States for a little over 50 years, and in the Japanese occupation for about 40 years, and then Cold War politics. So 1565 to roughly the present, even with the end of Cold War politics, the residues of the Cold War still remain. Now, the conjunction and the working through of these historical forces produce two things that I want to focus on. One is this thing called colonial democracy, and the second is oligarchic autocracy. Let's take a look at each of them. First of all, colonial democracy, or what some people have referred to as elite democracy. That is a practice of democracy that is relegated and limited to those in the ruling class. One of the things that characterizes colonial democracy, something that emerged precisely in and through all these waves of colonization, was the use of democratic means to produce undemocratic ends. Right? So you have elections in order to consolidate the power of those on top. And the result is to forge elite rule in colonial and post-colonial states, where the key practice, actually since the early Spanish colonial period, was elections. Elections was a way of organizing collaboration between the colonial state and native elites to get native elites to collaborate and cooperate with the colonial state in exchange for consolidating the power over the people below. Elections was a means of gaining access to the leverage of state power. It was also a way of organizing collaboration and counterinsurgency. One of the single most important functions of elections, certainly in the Philippines, but I suspect everywhere else, is precisely counterinsurgency. Right? How do you keep people from rebelling and from having revolutions? Well, you have elections. You promise them representation, right? And that's a way of saying, oh, okay, well, you don't have to take up arms. You don't have to kill us, right? Because you have elections. So elections are a way of organizing collaboration and insurgency. It is also a way, once you have people in place on top, of sort of controlling the means of corruption. Now, corruption is a feature of any state apparatus, right? There's always going to be a way for people to as it were, steal from the public trough. But this way, elections, by securing the positions of people on top, have the capacity to organize how this corruption unfolds, right? Who gets what from whom, and so forth and so on. And it also has the effect, certainly in the Philippines, of transforming local elites who participate in elections into national elites, right? Into a real national ruling class, right? And that's one of the most important things about elections, is the way in which they allow for the consolidation of a national ruling class who have who not only have power on the local level, but who can generate and transform that local power into national power, and vice versa, right? They could use that national power in order to further their local power. And in the case of the Philippines, perhaps much less in the US and other places, that conversion of local power into national power is made possible through the workings of political dynasties. Political dynasties in the Philippines are so important. 80% of Filipino politicians in Congress are parts of a political dynasty. Their wives, their sons, their daughters are mayors and congressmen and senators and so forth and so on. Political dynasties are the rule rather than the exception in the Philippines. And you can see how political dynasties connect through all this. They allow for the organization of corruption, they allow for the conversion of local power into national power, and so forth and so on. So what you have in the Philippines is actually a structure of oligarchical rule, right? And this is true in lots of other places. You look at Latin America, you look at other places. Oligarchical rule is, again, the name of the game. Oligarchical rule in autocracy is precisely what makes authoritarianism possible. So when people look at authoritarianism and they look at one figure, that's not entirely right. What makes that singular figure so powerful is because he in this case, it's always usually, is supported and sustained by this oligarchy. So it's always, when you think about dictatorship is impossible, not only by the power of a particular person, perhaps supported by the military, but supported by an entire class structure, right? That structure, oligarchy is what makes possible something like a dictatorship or authoritarian ruler. As I said, it's organized around political dynasties. Political dynasties are very important. However, it's important to emphasize that the ruling class, at least in the Philippines, is never homogeneous, right? Precisely because they're made up of these different families, there's a tendency for competition, lots of competition, right? So, I mean, in some ways, it's very feudal, right? Where you have different aristocracies contending for one another, right? Trying to gain, as it were, the top position. As you think about the king is really, an aristocrat, the first among others. And what sets apart the king, at least since the 17th, 18th century in Europe, is that he's supposed to be guaranteed by God. He's supposed to be an absolute figure, right? You don't have that in the Philippines. So it's this constant contentious relationship among its oligarchs. And so it gives rise to crisis of power. So occasionally you'll have a single autocrat sort of rising above this oligarchic ruler. You have Quezon in the 1930s, you've got Marcos in the 1970s, you've got Duterte, and right now we're ready to say, right now it's Marcos 2, it's Marcos Part 2, the son. So we'll see what happens. So what you get are these periods of stability when you have a strong man, as it were, is able to control this competition. And then it's followed by crisis, sometimes even revolution, when the strong man is unable to do this. So, this flux, right, of power that allows for certain people to emerge and then to be submerged as a result. And after a crisis, historically, at least in the Philippines, usually what happens is that after crisis, it's usually followed by a period of restoration. So, last big one was 1986. You had the big EDSA revolt, people revolted, they threw out Marcos, but it was soon followed by a period of restoration of colonial elite rule. So it opens up the discussion, why is it the case? I mean, why is there this persistence of colonial and elite democracy and oligarchical rule, right? Or why this constant sort of return, as it were, of the oligarchy? And here are some provisional thoughts, and again, provisional thoughts that come out of certain kind of historical consideration. First of all, there's something about the structure, right, of a Philippine political culture that emphasizes the importance of something called patron-client ties. You can call it a bunch of other things, right? But patron-client, for the sake of argument, I'll just call it patron-client relations, right? What is this patron-client relations? Well, broadly speaking, it's about a kind of moral economy, first of all, right? It's not just political economy, it's moral economy that's based on unequal reciprocal relations between those on top and those at the bottom, right? The dyadic relations, however, they're formed, and it's formed across different class relations, is not guaranteed by a third term. There is no judicial structure, there is no state formation, there is no metaphysical principle, as it were, that guarantees these dyadic relations. So they could shift. They're non-contractual, they're extra-legal. For that reason, they're highly unstable, and they're prone to conflict. So there is something about patron-client ties. On one hand, produces a sense of security. If you have a great patron, no problem, right? If you have good clients, right, who support you, fine. But precisely because there's nothing that guarantees these ties, what you get is the constant reproduction of inequality. Inequality that, of course, precludes democracy, right? In a world of patron-client ties, there can be no equality. In fact, people reject equality because equality is a recipe for instability. Okay? You don't want equality. You want inequality in order to have secure patrons, secure clients, right? So in a world of patron-client ties, democracy is impossible. And therefore, it is liable to crisis given the instability of reciprocal expectations, right? They're never. Sometimes your clients will expect something you can't deliver. Then the clients will overthrow you. Then a new patron emerges, and then they shift to a new patron, and so forth and so on. So the flip side of this is in a patron-client situation, class conflict is very difficult. I mean, you can have class conflict, but class conflict tends to be squashed because people tend to identify upwards, not across the way, right? So that's what. Secondly, another aspect of Philippine political culture, which I talk about a great deal in my book, and which is related to the idea of patron-client, is this idea of compelled intimacy. You got these practices of compelled intimacy. What do I mean by this? When you have patron-client ties, you have such practices such as, in the Philippines, it's very common to have this idea of utang na loob, that is debt from the inside. People feel indebted, right? And feelings of reciprocal indebtedness, right, create a sense of closeness, of intimacy, right? There's a sense in which, in order to sort of establish these patron-client ties, you have to, in some ways, establish a certain kind of proximity, a certain kind of relationship of intimacy to those below you and to those above you, right? Hence, intimacy, this sense of compelled and compelling intimacy becomes the basis of community, right? Providing, again, affective grounds of belonging. And it's all about affect, right? You feel like you can follow this person because you feel close, you feel like this person understands you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. An example of this affective relationship that comes out of patron-client relationship is this thing called pakikisama, right? In the Philippines, pakikisama comes from the word sama, which means to come together, right? It's the idea of coming together. And it has a way of defining who is inside and who is outside the circle of social reciprocity, right? Who you owe your debt of the inside, your utang na loob to, right? And those that you don't bother because they're not part of that circle, right? And this is especially true among poor communities. I mean, see, this cuts across social classes, but among poor communities, this is especially important. Poor communities, slum communities, for example, live close to what you might call precarity. They lead very precarious lives, day-to-day lives, and so they're very short on resources. As a result, they need to rely on people, not just their neighbors next door, but people from the outside who might be able to give them the resources that they need. Right? And so you have a situation which is true among poor people, but I think it spreads out. It is true among everybody, where intimacy is both compelled and compelling. You have to be intimate. Otherwise, you can't rely on your neighbors. Right? So it's very compelling as much as it is compelled. And what you get is a situation where communities are built around mutual aid among members of a community. That becomes a necessity. Right? But here's the trick. Pakikisama and these relations of intimacy rely on the constant exchange of resources. Right? So those who have more resources can have more claim on the people below. Right? Those who have less resources find themselves far more dependent, right, on those people who have resources. So there has to be this sort of, again, relationships of inequality, right? Intimacy creates relations of inequality, in a sense that those who have, it creates this gap between those who have resources and those who have less so. And this situation where you have less resources, so it puts you at odds, puts you in the bottom. And if you want to move up, if you want to survive, if you want to stay in that circle of reciprocity, you need to have the means to gather more resources. And this practice of gathering more resources in order to stay within that circle is a practice called discarte. You could see the Spanish sort of root of this kind of thing, which means in the Philippine case, it means improvised accumulation of goods and resources. People say, you have to know how to make discarte, right? My kid is sick in the hospital, I don't have money to pay for it. Well, tough, you have to make discarte, right? I don't have money to pay for my daughter's tuition fee. I got to make discarte, right? So you have to figure out a way of improvising, of gathering accumulation of goods. And this usually entails both licit as well as illicit means of gathering resources. You could sell food on the roadside, or you can sell methamphetamines, right, to your neighbor, right? It could be licit or illicit. There's no difference. The important thing is you gotta make do. You gotta improvise. You gotta find a way of making it work. Without discarding, you cannot participate in these reciprocal patron-client ties. Right? Hence, you have a situation where the demand for intimacy, this compelled and compelling intimacy, ends up producing a kind of conservative political culture. Right? It ends up with a situation where people are less invested in things like human rights, equality, democracy, because primarily they're concerned with gathering social, cultural, political, and economic capital in order to be able to participate in these relations of reciprocity, right? Instead, you have the investment in the reproduction of inequality and security. Right? Once again, this idea that because in the West, we tend to be very invested in these relations of equality. Of course, we should all be equal, right? But in non-Western context, people think, equality? Are you crazy? Right? If we have equality, who am I going to go to if I need something? Right? Who's going to protect me if I'm in trouble? Instead, you have this investment in inequality. So it's the reverse. Right? So now let's look at all of these aspects of political culture in the context of Duterte's drug war. Collaborating with the police, which is crucial to conducting the drug war, because the drug war relies on people providing names of addicts, of pushers, etc., to the police, and the police then go on and deal with these people. They arrest them, they kill them, etc., etc., etc. That this kind of collaboration with the police is a form of discarding, right? It's a form of improvised, because what happens is that when you provide names to the police regard that as a favor, therefore I'll give you something, right? And the need to accumulate social capital, therefore, this practice of discarding easily leads to betrayal and to murder. You can rat on your neighbor, even if it's not true. And in fact, evidence suggests that many of the people that were killed during the drug war had nothing to do with drugs. No, it was just that their neighbor simply ratted out on them. They didn't like them. The guy had an affair with my wife. I really don't like him, so I'll just, tell the cops that he's a drug dealer, or he owes me money, never paid me back. I'll tell the cops, blah blah blah. So what you get is a situation where violence underlies and is constitutive of intimacy, right? So we think of intimacy as a very nice, positive feeling, but in this case, the more intimate you are, the more vulnerable, the more open to being betrayed, to being killed, right? So the very means of forging community, pakikisama, patron-client ties, discarte, intimacy, can be turned around. It can also be the very means for destroying community. And this is why I call this situation that you have under Duterte, and in fact possibly under other authoritarians, as a kind of autoimmunity. Now what you get is autoimmune community. Right? Now, what do I mean by this? Let's take a closer look at this idea of autoimmunity. If you remember Benedict Anderson's Imagined Community, some of you may have read it. Hope you have, and if you haven't, you should, because it's very useful. One of the arguments in Ben Anderson's book is that the nation, because he was a big fan of the nation, right? He thought the nation had these utopic possibilities, right? And that the nation, not the nation state, but the nation, right, divorced from the nation, because he didn't like the state too much, but the nation itself had all these utopic possibilities because it was a way for people to gather together without necessarily knowing each other, without necessarily recognizing each other, right? The terms of recognition are very abstract: symbols, flags, money, right? Visions, hope, constitutions, etc., etc., etc. You don't have to know the person, every single person in the nation in order to be able to subscribe to these ideas and so forth. So you had a community amid anonymity. The model for me here is like, people watching a movie. You all share something, which is a movie, even if you don't know the person sitting beside you. You all get to enjoy the movie. You all get a chance to talk about the movie, even if you don't know the people beside you. Contrast that with the situation that emerges in Duterte's drug war, which is the autoimmune community, which is the very conditions for forging community also end up becoming the very conditions for destroying it, right? Because that's what autoimmunity is. It's when the body recognizes itself as its own enemy and so destroys it. So what you get in the autoimmune community is ongoing civil war. And you can argue that that's perhaps what's going on today, right? That many people sort of see the United States as characterized by autoimmunity, right? Where certain figures are seen as enemies, perpetual enemies that have to be extinguished, as it were. Now, Duterte's discourse contributed to the sense of autoimmunity. It did not originate it, right? But it contributed to the sense of autoimmunity. And this is the frontispiece of my book. And the thing is that he actually does this. There are lots and lots of pictures of washing a finger. If you listen to it, and again, if you want more details, I have it in my book. He moves between vulgarity and violence. He loves to tell, awful jokes about shooting people, about raping women. Sounds familiar, right? And so forth and so on. And he's an incredibly good storyteller. It's one of the reasons why he became very popular is his storytelling abilities were really quite remarkable. Again, sounds very, very familiar. But the storytelling was always laced by threats, right? So it's always very deadly. And with the Duterte, what you get is a production of fear at the same time the promise of security. It's these two things that go together. So it's very common for people to say, "Oh, it's great to have Duterte. Our neighborhood is so safe now. We don't have to worry about gangs pouncing on us. All the drug dealers are gone, etc., etc., etc." Right. So, but at the same time, there's this idea of fear that without him, these guys are going to come back. So these two things, and the effect, of course, is to normalize the killings, to see the killings as necessary, even if it involves your family members. So it's really common for people to say, "Oh yeah, my son was shot dead. It's his fault. We told him to stop doing drugs. He didn't stop. He got killed. There's nothing else we can do, right? We just have to move on." So you have the sense of things being normalized as a result of the drug killings. And in that sense, Duterte positioned himself as the patron par excellence. He was the guy from whom people went to get things, principally security. And he had a tendency to criminalize dissent, everyone who questioned him. And what you get with Duterte is a certain kind of authoritarian narcissism, which accompanies the authoritarian imaginary. It's kind of a narcissism where everything revolves around him. And people who identify with him assume that kind of narcissistic tendency. Now, are there alternatives to this autoimmune society? And here I want to end with some suggestions, and then we can have a conversation. Historically, there's always been challenges to elite colonial democracy, always, ever since the beginning. Rebellions, revolutions, smuggling, all kinds of stuff. Crisis and contingency are built into these relationships of compelling intimacy. Some examples. My favorite example is overseas contract worker. Yeah, as you know, the Philippines is a big supplier of overseas contract workers abroad. Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia, United States, everywhere, Europe, everywhere you go, there are Filipinos. Something like 10 to 12% of the population has a relative that is working abroad. And many of these are women. And one of the things that happens in overseas contract work is that precisely because the majority are women, what happens is the men get left behind. And it shakes up that whole patriarchal patron structure of the family, right? The structure of the family really sort of goes through tremendous amounts of disturbance, right? And it's interesting, really, to think about patriarchy and patronage as connected, because if you look at the root word of patron, it's pater, it's father, right? So it shakes that up because it places women as the supplier of money and the supplier of goods, right? And it has the effect of basically demasculinizing men. Right? And that process of demasculinization, as I said, has the effect of sort of subverting the patronage structure of the family, which is why it's not surprising that most OFWs, overseas Filipino workers, are big fans of Duterte. They look to Duterte as the father who will restore the order, right? Who will provide what's been missing in their lives, but precisely, reproducing this kind of patriarchal figure. So this is absolutely lovely. The NGOs, of course, advocating for human rights are other areas where you can see this resistance. And now it's becoming more important because Duterte is being questioned in the Senate as we speak. And there's a good chance that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, will be welcomed into the Philippines by the current administration for reasons that we can talk about later, and proceed to persecute, proceed to try Duterte. So that's important. There are union organizing, although unions, like everywhere, are very weak. There's feminist organizations, and again, that's very problematic. There's a lot of church activism that David has been sort of writing about. That's been very helpful in safeguarding human rights and protecting people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what all of these have in common is that they tend to sort of assert the dignity of the individual rather than the power of the ruling class. So what you get is a situation where people who are killed are, as it were, mourned, right, and treated as I said, dignified individuals rather than simply, these criminals that are sort of taken away. I'm going to end with an example of these organizations. Very interesting. In 2022, when we were still in the midst of the pandemic, there's a very interesting thing that emerged in the Philippines called community pantries. This was begun by a woman named Ana Patricia Nunn, right, who is connected to the University of the Philippines. She was sort of an activist, but not really. But what she did is something very, very interesting. She decided to spontaneously, right, start this movement, which she called community pantries, whereby she would put out goods that she thought people needed, and she invited those in the neighborhood to come and provide goods, right? So she would put out rice, she would put out food, she would put out medicine, and she would basically tell people, listen, if you have stuff that you can afford to give up, there's a lot of people who need stuff, please bring them over. And this just began to mushroom and to grow, not just in Manila, but in many other parts of the city where people felt this sort of enormous pull, not so much to take, but to give, right? So you had a situation where these community pantries did not sell stuff. They were not organized around capitalist markets. Rather, they were organized precisely to circumvent capitalist markets. Right? These were just goods that people would give and people would take, right? And what it did was it cultivated this ethos of mutual aid and unconditional generosity. So very different from pakikisama, or very different from patron-client ties, in a sense that you didn't have to acknowledge who gave you this stuff. You didn't have to identify yourself. You just got what you need. You needed Band-Aids, you got Band-Aids. You want bananas, there are bananas. You have extra underwear that you don't need, you can give, you just gave it, right? And so there was an attempt, at least in my reading, to restore the community amid anonymity. A kind of ethos of generosity without limits, right? Without limits. And you can see this in their pronouncements, right? So these are things that Patricia Nam would say, magbigay ayon sa kakayahan ko mo, give what you can, take what you need. And it was spurred by this ethos of bayanihan, which is this notion of anonymous, reciprocal, and much more important, contagious generosity. It's like when people saw them, people saw these community pantries, say, oh, this is really interesting. And they would just come and give stuff. Or they would come if they needed stuff, they would come and take it, right? It was really contagious. It spread all over the country. In fact, it became so contagious that the military became really suspicious. And a lot of them started thinking, oh, this must be a communist plot. The communists must be doing this. And they threatened to arrest Patricia and all these other people, but that they couldn't really find any evidence of that, right? So they just let them go. Pag may isang gumawa ng mabuti, lahat gagaya. As I said, if someone does well, everybody follows. Right? Kung buong community tutulong, masusustain siya. Hindi imposible. Hanggat may nangangailangan, hanggat may nagbibigay. If the whole community works together, it will be sustained. It's not impossible. It will work as long as there are people in need, and therefore people who are willing to give. And you have to remember, this is in the middle of COVID. This is in the middle of the drug war. This is in the middle of recession. People, hardly had any money, and yet there was this explosion of generosity. Where you could go to certain streets, and there would be like these free things that you can get. So here is an example, and it sort of stopped for a while, and now it's picking up again. I was just reading where things were picking up again, and these community pantries are emerging again. So here's an example of the way in which, in the context of the drug war, in the context of oligarchy, authoritarianism, it's possible, right? It's not exactly resistance, but it's another way. It's another way, and I think that's sort of what I like about this example. So let me stop there, and we can have Q&A.
Maybe you could have a seat.
Oh, okay.
We thought that to briefly start the conversations, my colleague Simone Bartaco would come up also from Professor for Postcolonial and Translation Studies, Department of Comparative Humanities. Would join us up here, and from our different perspectives, we would offer quick reactions to Vince's work, and then plenty of time for conversation. So I couldn't resist putting a couple of pictures together of my own up here. There's no words, I don't think, just that I thought could start some conversation. So I just have three quick kind of reactions and / questions. The first relates to the kind of response to the trickster, right? And this is something that I think is in the background of your work and even of your comments today. Two themes, right? You have this great quote in the book about how Trump kind of inverts the colonial dynamic, because Duterte helps us understand Trump, not the other way around. He's subversive in inverting the colonial relationship. And I had kind of two just quick reactions as I was thinking about this today. One is the reaction that we've seen to increasing support for Trump in this election from Black and Latino communities, particularly men, but not only. And a certain undertone at times of how could this be from kind of liberal elites? How could this be? These are the communities who he's working against, right? This happens in the Philippines too, right? It happens with support from Duterte in the urban poor communities where the violence is the most intense, right? And I think that your work helps us to understand that simply lecturing communities on what their self-interest should be misunderstands the decision-making that's going on within those communities, right? And so again, I think that this phenomenon has been going on in the Philippines related to the urban poor communities and their support for Duterte for a half dozen years now, right? And it's not surprising, and I think that your work helps us to understand I think it poses a question about, well, what then is the kind of way forward for national level elites, not the local level folks that you point to in the community pantries, although I want to talk about that too. But at the national level, what's the opposition to do, right? This is an image here from just after the last election when Marcos Jr. gets voted into power and the kind of liberal opposition under the leadership of Lenny Robredo fails, right? And they fail for complicated reasons, but they essentially try to bring the 1986 coalition back together. This is actually a mural that's on the wall of a religious congregation. It's a painting of Baclaran Church there, along with the mural of Laney, trying to bring this kind of church, good governance, civil society coalition back together. And it doesn't play in this new environment, right? And so I love the way you conclude at the local level, and I want to talk a little bit about that. But I am wondering, what do you think on the national level, right? If we can't just get the third wave band back together and play the old hits, and I don't think we can get the band back together. What does it look like at the national level? I guess it is a tricky question. The other point that I just wanted to raise related to your work, which you didn't talk about today, but is really fascinating in the project. You have in another essay that you've published on photography and the kind of politics of photography, and some of you may have read this essay. It's well worth checking out. It's a chapter in the book and also a freestanding essay. On the left side, these are images from the drug war that were compiled from photojournalists who saw themselves as involved in the political opposition. They wouldn't necessarily, well, some of them would have said that openly, some of them would have said, I'm just doing my job, but they understood their work as being trying to shine a spotlight and undermine the violence, right? And yet, by the end of the drug war, in my last period of field work there, when talking to a lot of these photojournalists, they understood their work quite differently. They said we were used. They said he wanted people to see. He wanted people to see the violence, and we helped people see the violence. That's why they cooperated with us. That's why nobody minded when we took these pictures, right? And there was a real kind of almost despair among some of these folks about whether their work actually furthered these conservative ends, right, as you put it in the book. And, I think that one question I would have would be, I think there's a lot of truth to that in the moment. We have, though, in the longer term now, seen some of the work that those folks did continue to be central to the ongoing accountability process, right? So there, the role of kind of photography and art in general, particularly journalism and photography, maybe not in broader moral persuasion, but at least in laying a groundwork for eventual accountability, maybe another path forward that is not about necessarily changing everyone's hearts and minds, but may still matter to furthering human dignity in the long run. I'm also very curious, partly because of your partner's work, also what you think about memorialization in this period. Right? This picture on the right here is a picture of the sort of national memorial to drug war victims that's been launched in large part through funds and land, even I think donated by one of the Catholic dioceses in the country. And this question of how do we memorialize this period, I think is really fascinating to think about. I know you're at firsthand experience thinking about those questions. So then just very briefly on the last point. So actually, I didn't know if you would talk about the community pantries. I have a little clip here on the community pantries. And it's actually reminiscent of some work that went on a little bit earlier before COVID in some of the dioceses of the National Capital Region by the Catholic Church to build what they called mission stations. And the idea here was that the church wasn't present in the slums where people were getting killed. And it needed to be. It needed to be physically present in order to be a lived reality in the lives of the local people. But one question that I just have for you is, how do you, both with the community pantries and with the mission stations during the drug war, how do you think about them in relation to concepts like discarding? Because there could be one interpretation of why mission stations mattered that said, well, actually they mattered because they were able to navigate discarding effectively, not challenge it necessarily, but actually kind of leverage local power, right? That there was an inability of locally placed religious leaders to engage in the give and take of local politics in a way that could protect communities, but without actually sort of challenging or trying to overthrow that local pattern of authority tied to Barangay captains and police officials. So I'm just curious how you think about the relationship between the community pantries, maybe the mission stations, and discarding and those other kind of intimate practices. So anyway, thanks so much. I'll get out of the way. And so,
Do you want to answer first? So
switch back over.
my questions come from the,
What should we put?
do you want me to just?
Whatever you want. The camera will get us here too, so that's
Yes, no, I don't need that because I don't have any slides. So my question comes from a different angle. And as I was mentioning to you yesterday and today, we read one of the chapters from your book for our class. We focused on chapter 3, is Duterte's values, on the aesthetic of authoritarian vulgarity.
Yeah.
So this is part of a seminar in which that is entitled Voice, Accent, and Text. And if we look at the way in which voices are represented in literature, in the archive, in performance, but we also think and ask questions about how we listen to voices, how we talk about them, how we read them when it's in the literature, voices of others, voices of communities, and so on. So my question really has to do with the aesthetic of vulgarity and the role that intimacy plays in it. Something about Duterte's accent. There is a story about it that you mentioned, his bad language that you say propelled him to the presidency. So, thinking about the material you have to review, you were mentioning over lunch how much it came from newspapers, it came from reporting of managers of speeches, really, then the speech, the voice, the recorded voice are really, really important in the book, but also in the method that you had to devise to write this book. And having read several of your books, was always been surprised at how you craft a methodology that is not just interdisciplinary, but really crafted on the basis of the materials that you take into consideration. So I want you to guide us a little bit into this, and then we cannot have a world-renowned scholar of translation studies and not ask a question about translation.
Yeah.
So my question about translation has to do with something that you call mistranslation at some point. You're talking about human rights as a Western imposition in many colonial settings, and how this idea of universal human rights sometimes gets mistranslated when, in this case, there's this notion of justice, which is kind of defense of honor, but also very much revenge, with interest. So if you have time, if you could talk a little bit about that, about the work you had to do, linguistically speaking, to really build the corpus for you.
Yeah.
They would be my 2 points of
Yeah. The last question is very difficult. I have to. It's something I've thought about, but I haven't really come up with a satisfying response. How do you translate human rights, or better yet, how is human rights mistranslated in these different contexts? And I think that's true. And it's a question you can ask about the Philippines. There's also a question you can ask about the United States. I mean, do people understand human rights in this country? I'm not sure. I'm sure they understand human rights. Because human rights is sort of, rooted in this very Enlightenment notion of human dignity, right? What is human dignity? Well, if you follow the classic definition, dignity, it's according to a person, means that the person is treated not as a means, but as an end in their own right? You never use that person as a means, but as an end in their own way. So, and these discourses of human rights, they're so complicated. When you have a country that's dominated by capitalism, where capitalism goes without saying, right? And capitalism is always premised precisely on the reduction of people into labor power, into commodities, where they are means for profit rather than the end. What happens to the question of rights? Right? It's very complicated. And you can ask that question in the Philippines if people have these relations, patron-client relations, which is a very instrumentalist sort of thing. This tendency to treat people as instruments for certain ends, means for certain ends. How do you even begin to talk about it? Is the discourse of human rights something that it needs to be? It needs to be reinvented. It needs to be retranslated. I don't know. Maybe I'm sure there are people here smarter than me that can figure that out. So that's one thing I would say. And then what was your question? The first question was accents.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned that.
Yeah, no, because you have to remember, Duterte is from the south. It's vernacular. It's not just Cebuano, but what's called. It's a particular kind of vernacular, Cebuano, and it's one of those things where people in Manila tend to make fun of that accent. It's like people in this country make fun of the southern accent. So it really from the south, and the whole north-south thing is. So for him to be able to get up there and talk in this way becomes not just an object of ridicule for people, but it becomes under him becomes an object of pride. So he sees this. So I talk this way. So what? Right? I can threaten you. You can be scared of me, etc., etc., etc. And it's also for the same reason that he can engage in these vulgar exercises, and they are very vulgar. There's misogynist, sexist, and his excuse is always, well, that's the way we talk down there. What are you going to do about it? So in other words, he is a tendency to once again normalize a certain kind of vulgarity. That aesthetics of vulgarity, in fact, creates a relationship of intimacy, right? And what Mbembe calls conviviality. When certain kinds of authoritarian leaders talk this way, and you can see this too with Trump, right? When Trump talks in a certain way and insults people and uses certain words, his followers roar in approval. They love it, right? Because they say, well, yeah, that's the way we talk. He talks that way, and so it's okay. It's okay. So there's a relationship of conviviality that vulgarity enables, right? And that itself is very interesting. How is it that vulgarity enables conviviality? It's the way people are brought up. It's what you see in playgrounds. It's not uncommon to see that because it relies on scapegoating, right? With vulgarity, there's always a question of scapegoating. So there's always this idea of pointing to somebody once again who's outside, who doesn't belong to the group, and for that reason, there's a certain kind of solidarity that's created among people who share in this vulgarity. And there's enormous amounts of pleasure in that kind of solidarity. That's why people cheer, that's why they're happy, there's an enormous amount of pleasure. There's an enormous amount of conviviality, as I said, it's created in the case of being vulgar. And which is why, you have to, those of you, maybe, it's hard to resist vulgarity. I don't care how educated you are. I don't care how respectful you are. There are times when you gotta say it the way you gotta say it, when it comes out, and you're with people who you trust, who you friends, you feel so good. It's like, okay, I said it. Now, with regard to Dave's question about the church and these community pantries, I'm sure there have been connections. I just haven't looked closely into it because I was finishing this book at the time when these pantries were just beginning to emerge. But I wouldn't be surprised if they're very close connections, because the church continues to remain as a bulwark of civil society, right? And as a bulwark of civil society, it's very much involved in, as I said, not just protecting people from this kind of incidental violence, but ensuring a certain kind of dignity for those who are targeted. So yeah, and then with regard to photography, I think we had that conversation in the beginning when I was working on this project. I gave a paper questioning the validity of photography, if in fact photographers were this with the regime, and I got a lot of grief for it. We're suggesting this, but I think you're right. Now, when Duterte is once again in the limelight, these photographs will serve as very important sort of artifacts for sort of determining his guilt, his liability. And now that the government has allowed the International Criminal Court to come in and conduct their investigation, whereas before they resisted it, I think these photographs are really, really important. So, questions?
Yeah, let's open it up for conversation. Thank you all for being a great patient audience. So we can have to take questions for a few minutes.
And it doesn't have to be about Duterte. It could be about Trump. It could be about Orban. It could be about, yeah, please.
So you mentioned the church as a source of resistance. I think some of Dr. Buckley's work
Yeah,
kind of is in that vein as well. What happens, as in the U.S., if large segments of, say, Christian populations are inside the house instead of outside?
So, as you know, Christianity in the United States is a very complicated phenomenon. They're liberal Christians. They're highly conservative Christians. Liberal Catholics, highly conservative Catholics. So you have a situation where it's not homogeneous. Lots of internal conflicts, lots of differences within and out. And you get someone like, I can't remember the name of the white nationalist Christian guy who's sort of at the forefront. A lot of the stuff.
There's a few.
I know there's a few, but then you get someone like, what's his name, Butler, the guy in North Carolina, Reverend Butler, who's been at the forefront.
Barber.
Barber,
Yeah.
yeah, who's been at the forefront. Or
So
other.
there's not as many of them, so we do.
Yeah, not as many of them. But it goes to show how the discourse of Christianity can be mobilized for all sorts of purposes. How the institution of Christianity is not one. There are many Christianities. It's always been that way. The history of Christianity has always been a history of plural formations, conflicts, disagreements, etc., etc. So,
How does it align with the vulgarity, though? I mean,
yeah,
you would think there would be a direct backlash against the vulgarity.
and there has been.
But there was a book a couple of years ago where someone compared Trump's vulgarity to professional wrestling.
Yeah,
Like the
I
audience
get that.
interprets it as completely fake. So
Yeah,
do you think
yeah.
that's what the Christians in the pews are seeing?
Yeah, yeah.
Entertainment?
Yeah, I actually have a section in the book that compares Trump to wrestling. And the thing is, sure, I mean, some people may not like the vulgarity, but it's very interesting to see how people, at least in this country, quickly instrumentalize it and say, it's okay, that's just Trump. That's just Trump being Trump. And if it is directed at people that they don't like, that they consider their enemies, it's easily excused. Right? In the case of Trump, I find a connection with professional wrestling very interesting. Yeah. In the sense that, as I understand it, Trump was very responsible for reviving the fortunes of WWF. It was kind of falling down, and then he started going to the events, and people started paying attention. And there are scenes where he actually gets in the ring and hangs out with these guys. And there's something about professional wrestling that sort of reminds me of blackface musicals. And my argument is that Trump's association with professional wrestling is similar to sort of. I mean, if there was still blackface minstrels, he'll be out there doing it.
It's orange face now.
Huh?
It's orange face now.
Exactly. So you have to admit that he's an incredible entertainer. Yeah. And this entertainment in the United States, the history of popular entertainment, is also the history of racism. It's also the history of sexism. There hasn't been a popular entertainment genre that did not involve racial and sexist discourse. It's always been there. It's just kind of like turned in different ways. And Trump capitalizes. Yeah.
Thanks so much for the talk. It's wonderful. I'd like to return to two things. One, the dynamic with overseas workers,
Yeah.
and then your point about sort of the drive towards an authoritarian figure being tied to a sense of melancholy or some kind of loss, right? And you said pretty straightforwardly that the disruption of gender relations is part of this, right? That these are mostly women who are overseas working, sending remissions, and this interrupts things. And I was coming away from that comment, wondering how much weight to give that. Like, does this explain much of that drive to like, are there other things going on in Philippine society that you see as kind of, sort of pushing a kind of masculinist, gender authoritarian discourse, or is the remissions, is the overseas workers like the main thing? And if you could say more about that and just other things going on in society that would provoke a kind of sense of loss or melancholy.
Yeah, I think that's an important aspect of it, the phenomenon overseas contract. It's hard to say. There is definitely, people are poor. 70% of the population, live very precariously. And it's that sense of precarity that affects everything from gender identity to class identity, and so things that affect that. And there's all kinds of ways in which these kinds of cultural issues are reworked into political economic issues, and back again. It's that slide from one to the other, right? So, for example, I talk about this particular hospital in the Philippines, where it's the largest hospital in the city, where 4 women can go and give birth. And there's lots of them. In fact, it's so crowded that sometimes they sleep there and when they roll over, they're actually rolling over their own babies because it's so crowded. And so the women are there, they're giving birth, and it shows the men kind of trying to take care of them. There's a very interesting interview with one of the supervisors who were trying to get them to use birth control. And because many of these women are young, many of them are on their 5th or 6th puberty, right? And so they say, why don't you use birth control, like condoms, whatever? And the women all say the same thing, which is, well, my husband or my boyfriend or my mother won't let me do it, and that's because they think it's a sin against the church, or because my boyfriend will leave. If I have this kid, that's another way of ensuring that he'd stick with me, right? Because he has to take care of these kids. My mom thinks it's a sin; she won't let me do it. I don't want to do it because I think it's awful, etc. So you have a situation where I sort of think about this as kind of autoimmune situation, where the very thing that's supposed to allow you to survive is the very thing that's also killing you. Women having babies forced to, because as far as they're concerned, to do otherwise would result in a horrible situation. But as a result, they continue to have these very, very precarious lives. They can't pay for the kids, whatever. So here's another example of the way in which certain kind of cultural consideration slides into the political economy and then yeah. And the situation is such that people are forced to engage in illicit, for example, activities, including drug dealing and so on. So the search for an authoritarian figure, a strong man that will somehow put some order in this situation continues. Which isn't to say that there isn't order, because there is. When people know how to organize their lives around these precarious situation, it just sometimes it goes out of control. And I think the drugs, the introduction of shabu, which is meth, has over the years has really sort of worsened the situation. It isn't as if violence and precarity didn't exist before. It's the incredible sort of introduction of drugs has resulted in further intensive that. And you ask yourself, well, where did these drugs come from? Lots of sources. A lot of them came from the Chinese, smuggled them in. A lot of them came from political dynasties, right, who served as mediators. A lot of them came from the Turkish family. These kids are big drug dealers. So, yeah.
Maybe we could take a couple as we wrap up it, and then let Vince have a final comment. I saw one in the back. Yeah.
Yeah, I wondered, how does humor kind of play into nationalism and authoritarianism? Can it be used as like a weapon or a tool to kind of push back against this strongman image that nationalists use in their power politics? And can it hinder their kind of rise to power? Or do you find that only further alienates people from one another based on their support of these leaders and will only continue this autoimmune response?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it does both. It does both because humor is very plastic. It's very fungible. You can use it as a weapon of aggression, or you can use it as a weapon of resistance. Right? You can use humor to punch down, or you can use humor to punch up. Right? It depends on the context. Depends on the speaker, and so on. So yeah, the thing about humor is not. I mean. As you know, you watch any stand-ups. There's some certain stand-up comics that work because they go to the sweet spot of the culture. How to get there, as it were, resist certain kinds of impositions, right? This is particularly true with women comics. A lot of women comics are very good at doing this and sort of punching against sort of male supremacy. And then you get people like who's the guy at the Madison Square Garden who joked about blacks and Puerto Ricans, women, and all kinds of stuff. Or you can listen to any right-wing podcast. And it's full of this sort of. You feel they're belonging. They're not low enough either for their make them lower, right? Yeah.
Thanks for the very
All right,
informative.
this one more, yeah.
Oh, is there one more?
I was wondering about how much power Islamicists to exercise in the Philippines. And
Yeah.
do they forced to reckon with, and how is the relation between them and the central power? That is one question. And another question, you talked about different aspects of the Philippine society, but you didn't mention if there is a kind of legal means to restrain the power of a narcissist, or like a check and balance kind of, institutions. I don't know much about the Philippines.
First, the second question. One of the things that an authoritarian does, of course, is to try and bomb these institutions and try to shut them down. And to try and twist laws around, appoint Supreme Court justices, favor certain kinds of politicians, and very important, sort of assimilate or appropriate enemies. All of us should do this. Having control of the nuclear power groups. The first question about Islamists, it's very complicated. We have to have another. I will only say this, that the Turk comes from the south, and he has a history of trying to accommodate Muslim separatists, but at the same time, there's all kinds of conflicts with Muslims as well. So as I said, this could be the subject for another. I think there's one more back there. Yeah.
Oh, yes. So within your chapter that we read for our class, you talk about Duterte and his speeches and the vulgarity within it, and how feminists, human rights advocates, and the church hierarchy, they're critics of his speeches because of such vulgarity and other hateful and violent language. But later on, you talk about how when you go to his, the actual rallies, how these crowds are excited, jubilant over his speeches. You talk about how he's bribing his audience. Duterte is like a smuggler of illicit goods, promising forbidden pleasures and overturning repressive structure. He says what they would have wanted to say but could not.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do you go about combating this when you have a politician who is saying these things to their constituency that they want to hear and could not say when they're playing to their popular support?
Yeah. Again, it's a great question because it's a question you can use for in this country. You can ask about Trump supporters in this country, right? How do you resist it? How do you push back against it? I don't know because the thing is that the things that he says about women, for example, are so hardwired in people's minds. It would mean, a veritable cultural revolution. And how do you do this cultural? How do you tell people not so much that it's bad, but that it has awful effects. It doesn't have a good effect. It destroys people. It creates all kinds of terrible things. Because their answer to you is going to be, well, they deserve it. They deserve it. If we say these things and they feel hurt or they feel terrible or whatever, that's because they haven't come. They're awful people. They're the ones that are destroying the culture. They're the ones that are destroying society. So why shouldn't we make fun of them? Why shouldn't we say these things about them, right? And how do you argue about that? You have to begin by saying, no, they're not. They're doing this and that. And, we're all part of the same society. They're not going to believe you because they're very, as I said, convinced that what they're doing is not simply making fun of people. What they're doing is they're asserting their rights. That's really important. They're asserting their rights. They're saying basically that I have the right to say this about certain people because they represent a threat. They represent someone that is going to destroy me. And humor is one of the few weapons I have available to fight back against it. So they see society as a society that's characterized by constant civil war. And humor becomes a weapon that you can use to fight the civil war. Right? Short of having a gun to kill them, you have a joke that you can tell. Right? And what are you going to say? Wait, this is not a great thing to do. Wait, as far as they're concerned, this is a necessary thing to do.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. Maybe Emily, is there a little gift that we have for Professor Raphael? This is a small sign of our appreciation for joining us here on a day that started extremely wet. Luckily, this is a little bit wet, so for a writer needs bags, but also good notebooks and pens.
Oh,
So thanks so much. I'm not sure if there are snacks left in the back. Feel free to continue to snack away. Professor Raphael can probably hang around and have some conversation for a few minutes. And thanks all for being here. Really appreciate it.
yes.
Oh, yeah, we all need notebooks, right? We all need
Okay.